Good afternoon. I am Nick Rishwain, and I am the Vice President of Client Relations for Experts.com. Joining me today is Jack Young, and Jack is an accredited senior appraiser specializing in machinery and equipment appraisals, and also a certified public accountant. Mr. Young has been awarded a Master Personal Property Appraiser, or an MPPA designation from the National Auctioneers Association. He's got thousands of hours of experience as an equipment appraiser and is an active member of the Northern California chapter of the ASA, where you were the past chapter president.
Indeed.
That is sort of a short intro into your career. Maybe you can elaborate on some of the items that I left out and tell me a little bit more about yourself.
Well, the short soundbite is, I help people solve problems when it comes to values, and people are fighting over having a problem with coming up with, what's this stuff worth? And, my job is to perform a well-researched, unbiased opinion of value based upon the market that's germane to their situation. And that can vary quite a bit, whether it's a liquidation scenario, whether it's a in continued use scenario. So that's, there's a lot that goes in even before we do the appraisal, is really figuring out what's the client really needed here? What's really the problem? What's the question?
All right. Okay. And as we had sort of talked about, a big portion of what you do and what you market on experts.com for is your litigation support, your expert witness services. So your equipment appraisals, your machinery appraisals oftentimes end up in litigation, or you need to do an appraisal of some sort to establish a value in order, for an estate planning or maybe for a divorce or a family law matter of sorts. Is that accurate? And tell us a little bit about the types of engagements that you've participated in.
Well, as you indicated, there's kind of almost all my work has some kind of legal context of some type. And most of it is litigation support, expert witness type stuff. But, there's kind of a whole nother area that happens even before litigation, and that's the planning side of it.
Okay.
And ideally we'd like to, when people are going into arrangements, whether they marital or other kind of partnership arrangement, that they get an idea what they're going in with. A lot of times we get called in to figure out what it was that they were actually involved in, and sometimes they can save a lot of money by getting us all involved in the planning stage. So we do a lot of that. We do a lot of estate planning type of work where heirs are inheriting a large manufacturing, farming, some kind of productive asset based organization, and they want to make sure that for charitable, not necessarily charitable gift, but estate and gift purposes, mm-hmm. that those values are that what they're telling the IRS is accurate. And
so you're in that sense, you're talking, let's just say a friend of mine, Matt Crane, is in the chat here with us. And Matt, if you stick around for a while, would have you come in and maybe ask a question if you're interested. If you can't stick around, we understand. But if Matt and I are going into, and I'll use the partnership example that you started with, we're both buying into this farm. And it's got tractors and combines and things like that. You need to go in and establish the value of those. Is that correct? In order for us to know what we're buying into at the outset.
Well, going into a situation, everybody's optimistic.
Right.
And everybody thinks their stuff is worth a lot.
Right.
And on going out, things get a little bit hazy. So it helps to have a really clear things like your 34 tractors that you're bringing into the situation. and the other gentleman, Matt, he's maybe bringing in a small trucking company, and he's got some harvesting equipment, and like what's really being contributed here? And maybe you have some land, and so what exactly are your contributions to capital in this situation?
Okay, and we had talked briefly earlier today that you had made a good point that in an instance that you're involved in, I think right now, the land, the business, and the equipment and that type of stuff, those are different types of appraisals, and yours concentrates on the personal property, or what we refer to as chattel, specifically the equipment and machinery involved. Is that correct?
Yes, it leads into another. We can go lots of different places, lots of different times here.
Yeah.
So keep me on track.
Yeah, we want to. There's a lot to go through. Maybe talk about that, and then let's get into your industry standards in that, because I know we want to talk about a few things within the first 10 to 15 minutes here. So,
well, as you indicated, we deal a lot with family law, partnership disputes, ad valorem taxes, loan workouts, lease transactions, when it's really unclear as to what exactly is this lease arrangement supposed to do in the fair market world, as opposed to just a vehicle to take money or leave money in a company. Okay. So we do a lot of purchase price allocation. We get involved a lot with purchase price negotiations. It's like, well, what's the underlying assets worth of this company that we're buying?
Right.
And then there's some other there's some accounting stuff that has to be done, purchase price allocations and stuff like that. So that's kind of the big tent that we live under. Sometimes we get a little bit involved in some loss claims and litigation involved in how much of the stuff that was stolen or whatever.
Okay.
Do a fair amount of appraisal with that. But kind of another area that's really kind of up and coming that we're really and really want to encourage people to really look at is this area of appraisal review.
And in this appraisal review, that ties into the industry standards that you were talking about earlier, right?
It does. There's 3 areas that we're really reviewing when it comes to appraisal review. The first one is the appraiser's competency to do what he's or she is doing. And and then the second part is the standards that you just referred to, and we generally work in the United States under the what's called USPAP, United States Standards of Professional Appraisal Practice.
Okay, I'm going to put that
standards of professional appraisal practices.
I'm going to put the USPAP in the chat bar in case anybody's interested in. And that's the Uniform Standards of Professional Appraisal Practice. Is that correct?
That's it.
Okay.
And that's actually mandated by Congress, and especially for real property, but it has sections for personal property and appraisal review. So, we often run across these situations where we see appraisals that say they're in compliance with the Uniform Standards of Professional Appraisal Practice, and I'll just start using the term USPAP now.
Okay.
But they're not. Anybody can say, their car's worth $1 million, but maybe it's not.
Right.
So that's another issue. And then the last part of appraisal review is does this make sense to another appraisal? Appraiser. A lot of times attorneys want to know if what you've done, Mr. Expert, could be reproduced by another expert with similar qualifications and come up with about the same results. Mm-hmm. And sometimes I've had attorneys send appraisals to me. Looks good, Jack, and I look at it and it's like, well, it does look good, but it's not. And I won't get into the details of exactly how the wheels can fall off the bus, but we certainly run into that kind of situation. So,
and you said that you like to, if possible, prepare an attorney. Because what did you call it? Like a one-sheet wonder or something like that? You told me. Yeah,
we often see these appraisal reports. The slang term in the industry is a one-sheet wonder, and it's a sheet of numbers and some vague asset descriptions. 1972 Chevy truck. $5. It's like, okay, how many? First of all, what is it? Right. Really, does it have 4-wheel drive? And I'm using a really simple example that everybody could relate to. A
Relate to,
truck is not a truck is not a truck.
Right,
You know,
right,
how many miles has it got? Let's start there.
right,
What kind of cab has it got? So those types of different kind of components or whatever exist for almost all equipment.
right, right.
And but even bigger than that is like, tell me the story of why this is being appraised and what's the market you're assuming, what research you did to come up with this, your opinion of value, you know?
Right.
So, you know, so
you'd have to establish the market for that 1972 Chevy pickup truck. What is the market for that in order to come up with the appropriate value for that pickup?
Exactly. And this really gets to be a lot more complex when we're talking about, like we were talking about ag equipment earlier, although that's not all I do. I do a lot of manufacturing, plastics, metal, wood, so on and so forth. But, you know, let's just take, for example, a food processing facility that has a lot of installed equipment.
Okay.
And if you've never been in a food processing facility, let's just talk, for example, grain. I've done a number of grain facilities. And you've got screw conveyors and drag conveyors pulling product from all over the place, and they're all connected to different machines and different orders, timed and calibrated. It takes an incredible amount of capital to get that machine in place, running and doing what it's supposed to do within a process of other machines and within a whole system.
Right.
So if we're talking about a liquidation scenario, we don't care about all those installation costs.
Okay.
We don't care. But if we're talking about a partnership dispute or even a marital situation, a dissolution of a marriage, and we're trying to do some equitable distribution of assets here, then we've got a problem with, you know, it's not as simple as like, what's the selling in the marketplace? Well, first of all, it's hardly ever sold in the marketplace because people buy it and it costs so much to install it that they run it as hard as they possibly can, as long as they possibly can. And when it's done, it's done.
Right.
And they're putting a new one in there and they're hauling it up to the scrapyard because nobody wants it.
It sounds like in one of those situations, whether it be a dissolution of partnership or a dissolution of marriage, which is essentially also a partnership, is it not? In that situation where you're trying to establish a value of something like this equipment in a grain facility, I mean, I can't imagine you can just take this equipment and put it on the market and expect it to be sold either, right? I'm sure there some of that equipment is built for the particular facility that it's running in, right?
Well, you just touched on a very interesting topic there, Nick, and that is a lot of times these facilities will have custom made equipment.
Right.
It's just made for them, or they made it themselves.
Right.
You know, that's the wonderful thing that I personally love about this type of work is I meet some fantastically clever people that have engineered, you know, stuff to do things that, you know, they were just, farmers are especially good at that. They sit on the tractor a lot and they're generally pretty smart people, and they work out problems and come up with really interesting solutions. Yeah. And that's not just in farming, that's in all food processing. Right. So they've got a private label brand on something that they've created and a machine that they've designed or had designed to do a certain thing. And a lot of times in food processing, it's a special kind of closure. You know, that you know, if you go into the grocery store and you'll see many food products that have, how did they get that bag inside the box? It's a Ziploc bag. Right. You know, well, the machinery behind that's pretty fascinating.
I'm sure it is. And you, like you said, so some of this is custom. So when you're looking for a market to value this,
gets a little difficult.
It's difficult to establish, I imagine.
Yes.
And so I imagine that's where the litigation then gets it, the dispute. Does the dispute, I guess, let me tweak that and go a different direction. Does the dispute ever rise over the value of the machines? I guess it would have to be in a dissolution of the partnership or the business, or the winding up of a business. I guess that's where the dispute over how much, well, this is a piece of equipment is $2 million or you know, and somebody else wants it to be, no, it's a $700,000 piece of equipment.
Yeah.
How does that usually arise over the dispute over the values?
Well, as you indicated, there's two areas that come to mind right away.
Okay.
And the first one is, they're breaking up the band.
Okay.
and everybody wants their stuff or their value for their stuff, and the most likely scenario is the entity is going to continue.
Right.
So a lot of times the argument after I get kind of finished telling my story and making my argument, and which an appraisal really is. It's an argument, and a good appraisal is an argument with a lot of words in it.
Right.
That explains the story of where exactly we're going. And so a lot of times then the argument will go to whether or not what marketplace we're really assuming here.
Okay.
So I'm continuing, say my scope of work was, say, to assume a continuing operation. And then there may be an opposing argument that the lawyers get to work out is whether or not that's really a legitimate assumption or not. So and whether or not, well, this company really would be liquidated if blah blah blah.
Right. So we're assuming facts, not in evidence right now for our
Yeah. So kind of another area where I get involved quite a bit and is quite a bit right now actually is because of the economic downturn and turn in the famous Great Recession.
Yeah.
There was a lot of idle equipment out in the marketplace installed in plant facilities,
Mm-hmm.
and those basically it comes down to business property tax appeals.
Okay.
And so the entities still they made it through, and they're looking back at 2008, 2009, 2010 saying, I think we paid way too much property tax on this stuff because this stuff wasn't even selling
Mm-hmm.
in the marketplace. And especially I'm doing one actually today that has to do with the automotive industry for a 2010 valuation. Can you imagine? Do you remember what was happening in 2010 in the automotive industry?
Yeah, they were begging for money basically in 2010. I think, if I recall correctly, they were getting bailed out in 2010.
Yes, sir.
So I imagine the value of it at that time, what you're talking about is significantly different than what it would be either today or 2 or 3 years before that date. And how rapid, and we're about 20 minutes in, so I'm going to open up the seat in case somebody wants to come in to ask a question. But in the appraisal review, because just bring me back to that for a second. Can a dispute or a litigation be about? Will it ever be about the appraisal itself? Will that be like the crux of the issue of a litigation? I may not be making myself specific here. The appraisal review. Do you ever have the battle over? Well, this one's way off. So then they have to bring in another expert on their side, and then you come in on one side, and there's somebody else on another, and you're both just fighting over how much this initial one-sheet wonder or something was worth. Is that?
A lot of times the extra appraisal situation is driven by some kind of contract language.
Okay.
That if you want, and for example, a minority partner can get bought out anytime the majority partner wants to do so at XYZ, deal, XYZ, assumptions. Majority partner goes out and gets an appraisal, and somebody takes it to me and says, "Does this make sense? Does this meet the contract language?" I look at it and I say, "Well, yes or no, or whatever."
No, sure.
Yeah. And then a lot of insurance contract language, insurance policy language has that language in there that they need to get another, so I get hired by a lot of insurance companies.
Okay. Yeah.
And I actually get hired by a lot of insurance companies on both sides of that, not just the insured and the insurer, but also the insurance company hiring me to want to take a look at the appraisal or two appraisals, in fact, and for me to figure out, if there's any, what's the story here.
So you come in as sort of a third, they get to initial, and then you come in to kind of maybe to decide which of those two is more accurate for them. Do you come in as sort of a third party in that situation so that they can get 2 out of 3?
typically referred to as referee.
Referee, thank you.
Yeah.
And now, does that, when you referee it, do you usually, they want you to side with one or the other so that that's the one that they go to, or how's that work?
It depends. I had one a little while back. They were both so bad, I just had to call both of them, both parties, and say, come on, guy. One of them, poor guy. I started calling around to his CV, and it was like, no, he wasn't a member of any organizations.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Wow. So that's got to be, are you ever called in? We have legal now I don't practice. I've never practiced, and you can tell by my discussion of appraisal and valuation that it's been a long time since I've been doing legal research and actually in litigation-based stuff. But are you ever called in? It happens a lot in a medical malpractice case, or it happens in a legal malpractice case. Is there such thing as appraiser malpractice? And do you ever have to come in and when we were talking about the industry standards, like standard of care is a big thing in a lot of other fields, professional licenses, and like this was not done to the standard of care. Do they ever try and go back against the appraiser, and then you have to come in and look at an appraiser's appraisal and say, look, this he did everything within the standard? Does that happen in the appraisal community?
It does, but almost exclusively in the area of real property. Okay. So because real property, and this is kind of, real property appraisers are in fact certified by the state to do things certain ways, and it's all USPAP language. Okay. But with personal property, residential contents, gems and jewels, business valuation, that's a little bit, it's quite a bit looser. Okay. Unless you're dealing with the IRS, and if you're doing something with the IRS and you're actually signing the tax return, right. You better think. You don't want to be with one of those "what were they thinking" scenarios.
No, absolutely. That's a good point. And I guess that'll bring me two types of equipment. So I was on your website before we got started here, and ag equipment, farm equipment, grocery equipment, restaurant equipment, construction, manufacturing equipment. So the equipment idea is is broad. Yeah. So what do you see in most of the time? And this, it can be a little bit. We're past the time where the attorneys are probably going to spend time watching. So we'll talk about the equipment, but if somebody pops in and wants to ask about equipment type of thing, I figured this is more of the time that they would have an interest in the types of equipment that you've covered. So maybe you can run down a few really kind of interesting types of equipment that you've dealt with in the past.
Well, I think a week or so ago, I was up in the Washington State area, and this was a tax appeal situation, looking at a plant that does the coating and tempering of window glass.
Interesting.
Fascinating science behind it. They're the leader in the industry, and they've got a lot of equipment there that's, guess what, made by them, for them, and only them.
Right.
And they can deliver, some pretty high standards that the competition can't. And they have, not just the equipment to do it, but the equipment to test to make sure that the product actually did what. And some of this testing equipment can be very expensive. So
they're putting a coat on windows, like in the residence or on a building, or are we talking?
That window behind you,
okay,
likely has a coating on it. It's probably a double pane window.
Yeah,
and it has a coating on it that does a couple of different things. It creates an insulating effect. And actually, that's small microparticles of silver that's been attached, using a process that uses a great deal of electricity, and basically to charge it onto the window, and then it's sealed up. Yeah.
And so this equipment, they can't just turn around and sell this to anybody.
No, this is they sell to probably the best window manufacturers in the world.
But that for the equipment that you're talking about, this piece of
oh
equipment,
gosh,
it's built for their plant, and they just can't turn around and liquidate it if they had to. That's just
it's a really, for if they were to be into liquidation mode, a lot of it they'd probably cut up, and throw in the dumpster.
Okay.
Like drive a couple miles and then throw it in the dumpster.
Right.
Which I've actually seen happen with some custom equipment. It's very fascinating.
Right.
And then, and a lot of that equipment is some of it might be, could hit, some of the newer stuff could hit the used market.
Okay.
But a lot of this equipment has, like the machine itself may have a 20-year life, like the overall machine, but every 10 years you got to replace all the motors, and certain pieces of equipment within the major piece have a very different component life and cost way more than really drive the cost of the machine. So we have a really kind of a complex valuation situation here. Yeah,
that's interesting. That really is, because you would have to incorporate all those installation and maintenance costs as part of the value of the machine.
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah.
Okay. All right. And so that's a fascinating piece of equipment. So that was in a glass facility. What other kind of fascinating pieces of equipment have you seen in your career?
A couple of pieces I've had the pleasure to work on are gold dredging equipment. We're out here and there's still a lot of gold
up in those hills behind me.
It's still there, and there's a lot of environmental restrictions about how exactly it can be taken out of the ground and yada yada yada. But it's still there, and it's still being extracted, especially in the last couple of years, especially back in the recession when the gold prices were so high. So that's those tend to be pieces of equipment that are they've been rebuilt and rebuilt and rebuilt since, I think one I looked at was originally built in the early 1900s, and had been kind of retooled and retooled and retooled, and now we have a really complex valuation situation, and it's really kind of, then you start asking, well, how much does this thing really produce? So as opposed to the component value, how much does it produce, and what's its remaining useful life, and getting into some of those
calculations.
Because you can't start sitting there counting every motor and counting every pipe, and that game doesn't work.
And this may be too detailed for this particular conversation. It may be one for a more future conversation, but I know that we've got an article on your profile. We got quite a few articles, I think, or your blog posts or whatever, featured on a link to your profile. One of which was let me see if I can find it rather quickly here. There are 3 ways to determine equipment value. If we go down this, are we going down a rabbit hole, or?
No, let's go. This is an important conversation to have. I think it is good. I can take you back to to a topic we talked about earlier and why this is important.
Okay, great. Go.
Okay, so there's 3, probably best language as traditional approaches to value.
Okay.
So an approach to value is not a definition of value. A definition of value, for example, is like fair market value and continued use, forced liquidation value, orderly liquidation value. That's kind of where you want to go. So the map on how to get there is the approach to value, the approach to that value. And those 3 are the sales comparison approach, which most people are most familiar with. There's other comparable sales in the marketplace. We'll make adjustments to those comparable sales to determine a value of what my asset is worth. That's how houses are appraised almost always, right?
Yep.
Okay. So the second approach to value is more commonly used in these marketplaces like we were talking about earlier, when there's just no comparable sales, or very, very few. If there may be comparable sales, but the chance of across. I mean, typically to opine on a value using a sales comparison approach, you want at least three comparable sales that you can adjust and kind of. Now we see where we're at here. Now it gives us a range.
Right.
So, appraiser's job is to come up with one of those. So, cost approach, you may have one or two pieces out there in the marketplace, but they're not your make and model. They're different gears. They're, so now we're talking about what we call the cost approach. The cost approach basically says, what's the replacement cost new now? What are the depreciation factors of its on that asset? And there's a physical depreciation based upon wear and tear. There's the latest and greatest model may be 10% more efficient. Well, that's what we call functional obsolescence.
Okay.
The older machine. And then there's economic obsolescence, which are factors outside of the machine. Classic example in California right now for economic obsolescence are the issues with the California Air Resources Board's regulations on diesel-powered equipment.
Okay, that makes sense.
So older diesel engines, large fleets will have trucks with engines earlier than 2010. Those values are sinking now.
Okay,
they're feeling the effect of regulation. That's
the regulation.
Economic obsolescence. Now, the great thing about the sales comparison approach is it kind of incorporates all that stuff.
Okay.
But if we're using a cost approach, we're saying, well, replacement cost new now, and we're going to trend it down based upon these three factors that I just indicated: physical, functional, and economic.
Mm-hmm.
Now we have an appraisal problem.
Right.
What are those factors, and have we really considered them all?
Okay. I think I'm keeping up here. It's been, I think so. And so those are the first two. There's recap those two for me. One is
the sales comparison approach, which that's your house.
That's your house, sir.
So the cost approach is specialty equipment, unique equipment. A lot of times I'll come with an expert in the industry out in a site inspection. And I need them to reprice this stuff because they're the expert. So a lot of times I rely on other experts.
Somebody who's an expert on the actual piece or they're in that industry more than you are, essentially. Okay. Yeah. So we have the sales comparison approach, the cost approach, and then there's a third.
Then we have the income approach.
Okay.
So in very few cases in the machinery equipment world, can you actually tie a stream of income to one particular piece of equipment? That happens very, very rarely, and usually when there's a lease scenario. Okay. But
that seemed like what you were getting at with the gold dredging equipment. It seemed like you were talking about how much can it produce.
How much it can produce in terms of that was actually a cost approach.
Oh, was it? Okay.
Yeah, it was. Yeah, because you could put the stream of income in that situation was actually tied not only to the dredge itself, but where the dredge was licensed to work. Okay. So if you were to move the dredge someplace else, that math may not work out.
I got you. Okay. Yeah. All right.
But if you have a jet that's leased and has always been leased, and that happens a lot in aviation, is that aircraft are in fact leased, and they may have that's one of the situations where the income is directly tied to that asset.
So if we're talking about a 737 that's leased by say a small regional airline or something, all their money is coming from the planes that they fly.
Yeah,
and so that's where you get the income approach tied to that particular.
And this is what I've seen in kind of a misuse, and this is kind of one of the appraisal review kind of scenarios, is when our standards are misapplied.
Okay, that makes sense. That seems like because
so we had a piece of obsolete equipment in a case. The other appraiser couldn't find any comps on it. I was involved. I got involved. I called the local representative that sold that, and he said, "Well, you're not going to find any comps on it because it's a functionally obsolete piece of equipment. In fact, I don't think you can find many people that can even operate it."
Okay.
But the other appraiser went and used an income approach on that and came up with a huge value. And it's like, that dog doesn't hunt, you know?
Right.
That logic does not work because nobody else would buy it for that.
Right.
You know?
Right. And I'm trying to think for a layperson who may be watching this later on, less than an attorney, the functional approach you touched on. With the functional approach, it would be like my 1998 desktop. Is that's no longer having the which had a 4 gig hard drive versus versus my phone that's got 64, right? So is that the functional kind of thing you're talking about?
That's a great example of functional obsolescence.
Okay, all right. Good to where I'm today. If I tried to put information on that, it wouldn't have enough information to process at all, probably. Yeah. So okay, so that's functional obsolescence, and the economic could be tied to the regulatory, if I understood that correctly. The regulation, or what else would that economic obsolescence? How else would that work? We may be getting too detailed, but you know what? It's just you, me, and Experts.com in here right now. So let's talk about it.
I'd have to, it's a lot of times it's regulation driven of some type or another. It could be just, demand in the marketplace dried up for that piece of that item because another item is.
So the BlackBerry.
Bingo.
Okay.
That's a piece of, that's certainly economic obsolescence. The machine itself works perfectly fine.
Works fine, but it's just not being utilized nearly as much. Okay. We're talking about interesting or fascinating pieces of equipment. What are some more common pieces of equipment that you are called into? We're both Northern California. I know that we've talked about ag because ag's big in our mind. We have a lot of friends probably in ag. What are the most common types of equipment you're called in to appraise or to deal with?
Anything that is grown on a farm, got there, and got taken away using a truck.
Okay, makes sense.
And I've appraised a lot of trucking companies, and that the big ones, small ones. It's just we live in an area we have I-80 and I-5 kind of the confluence of those two, and in 99, of course. So there's a lot of food that's moving around the valley.
A lot, yeah.
A lot, and so that's kind of a lot of times. Ag doesn't just rely on. There's a lot of side industries involved in that get really, tractors. Of course, we see a lot of that, but then we get into some really kind of unique things. A little while back, we did a spraying outfit, and I mean, ag pesticide spraying and stuff like that. With gonna kind of stump myself here, the name of this type of sprayer, but it was a type of sprayer that basically is started in the painting industry, where they actually tag an ion onto the particle of spray, so it attaches to the plant quicker, and they can use a fraction of the
spray.
Yeah. So for cost purposes, it in the long term, the cost per use goes way down. The equipment itself is extremely expensive, but the cost per use, it goes way down. And we don't have issues with overspray and environmental issues. A lot of those go away. So that's we see a lot of lately. We've been seeing a lot of irrigation related stuff. Get quite valuable. Well-grown equipment.
Especially in the drought. I'm sure is that what you're referring to? Why those have gone up in price? Probably because now we got to drill deeper to find water.
Exactly, and the water that we have, we need to be much more careful about it. So we used to see these orchards getting irrigated with 4-inch pipe. With irrigation, and now we see these micro sprinklers and these elaborate, filter systems on the side of the road, so those sprinklers don't get clogged with sand. So that's a typical example of installed equipment that I would be, I've appraised quite a bit of.
Okay. Crop dusters, are the crop dusters, is that something you get involved in, or is that a different kind of specialty? Is that aviation?
Aviation is a really special niche, and okay. I work with a gentleman out of Los Angeles. That's kind of one of the great things I like to, it is about, being involved, actively involved in the American Society of Appraisers. If somebody calls me and I'm not exactly the right guy, I mean, I got plenty of business. If I'm not exactly the right guy, I find you the right guy.
Right.
Or gal.
And I think this is important, because I think this is important for litigation, for the respect, expert witnessing. If you're not the right guy, you don't want to do it.
No.
For your credibility, for, to avoid impeachment, to keep your practice running, you don't want to say, yeah, I can do that, and have it be something you don't do, because that's going to come back to bite you.
And it's also a USPAP requirement. I have to be competent or gain competency. And a lot of times I can gain competency in a lot of cases, but in, crop dusters, I'm gonna find you the guy, and it's probably not gonna be me, because that's people that have a tendency to do aviation do a lot of it and only do that. There's nothing simple about aviation. Nothing.
Right.
Not even valuing the parts for planes. That's not right.
I had a feeling asking that question that I knew the answer, but I thought it might be good to address it. Other industries that I found interesting on your website were, because I have some familiarity with the restaurant business and the grocery business. The restaurants, what kind of equipment are we looking at? Are we looking at fryers? Are we looking at what are we looking at to appraise in a restaurant?
Well, that's actually a really good question, because I use restaurants as a really great example of kind of the different ways to look at a marketplace.
Okay.
And we were talking about that earlier. So let's talk about restaurants and marketplace. So let's ask you some questions. Perfect. So we've got this. We've got a restaurant that's continuing to work, and two partners own it and operate it, and they're having a dispute, and they want to know. One of them needs to get out, so they can live happily ever after, and so now we need to know, what's the fair market value in use. So now you've worked in restaurants, I presume?
I've got some family who's involved in restaurants.
Great. So so we have a lot of stoves and stuff that can just be picked up, put on a dolly, and moved and sold, and that's fine. But about 20 to 40% of the cost to start a restaurant is going to be tied up in the ventilation system, a fire retardant system, a makeup air system, and walk-ins. Did I miss anything?
I think you covered it all. You know a heck of a lot more about it than I do.
Okay, so they're gonna want to know the value of all those things, and those. But what do all those things have in common? Oh, they're installed. So you just don't put them on the dolly and
move them out when you're done with that space. Right.
So if I get called from a bank and they say we have a loan workout situation here, and we need to know what the forced liquidation value is. In other words, we need to know if we have an auction tomorrow, or an auction in 30, 60, 90, 40 days, whatever the scenario is, we need to know what we're going to get out of there. Well, they're not the landlord, so anything that's attached to that building. Now, sometimes walk-ins can be popped out very, very easily, and sometimes they're attached. So I kind of that's one of the reasons I got to inspect the equipment, see what it is. But a lot of times you'll see these walk-ins with raised floors. Those things can be knocked down. But if you walk in and it's got a tile floor, the same as the tile before the walk-in, guess what? It might be attached to the building, in which case the landlord is going to say, that's real property.
that now belongs to me.
Especially with the ventilation system, the makeup air, the fire retardant system, and all those systems. So you know how that works,
right?
So that's, like I said, it can be 20 to 40% of the cost of a new restaurant, and that stuff is not going to go, that's not, a lot of times I'll put it
You may
on.
not be able to liquidate that very
Exactly. I'll put it on an appraisal. It's not liquidated, part of real estate, and I'll just put it on another schedule. It says, here are all the things I looked at that I'm calling real estate.
Okay.
You guys can, work it out. If you decide otherwise, let me know. I'll value it, but I'm not.
Right.
If it's obviously attached to the building, I mean, it's kind of dicey with restaurants because you have less shelving that's attached, stainless steel shelving that can be easily removed. That's
right.
But when you're talking about compressors on top of the roof and copper wiring through the copper tubing, copper pipe through the walls, and
you made a good point about it, the restaurant being a good example of a market, which I think I thought I saw where you were going with that. I mean, some of this stuff is built for a particular location, so you can't just, unlike maybe a franchise restaurant where they have the exact specs of the building and everything's built the same way, and you can just sort of crank them out. If you go into a shopping mall, or some of this stuff's built for that location, probably doesn't have the same value at liquidation because it can't be just easily purchased, or can some of that stuff be bought up and repurposed by another restaurant?
And
is there
the classic attorney answer is, it depends, of course. And you touched on a really good, since a lot of these fast food restaurants have specialty equipment that's made for them, for their franchise, for their product, that does, puts the taco in the special, mold or whatever, and it is part of their franchise process.
Right.
And that has, a lot of times stuff has very, very little, if any, value,
elsewhere.
It may be scrap value, maybe the highest and best use of that stuff.
Yeah, and that's what I was thinking. Maybe some of the stuff, when a location is positioned a certain way and you have to fit certain things in there, maybe this stuff doesn't have a heck of a lot of value for somebody else, or on the market, or aftermarket.
If all the dining room chairs are Taco Bell colors, Taco Bell colors, it's like,
you're not going to put it in the family restaurant. You're probably not going to be able to do it. Grocery equipment. So what is the walk-ins, I'm assuming, are also the same in grocery, although they take up a bigger portion.
Once again, we got a huge issue with installation here.
Okay.
What's the difference between the grocery store and the big box store right next to it that doesn't have any refrigeration? The difference is the refrigeration. Yeah. Without that, not unlike a restaurant, a grocery store is kind of its own little plant, its own little facility, and a lot of that is driven out of a lot of refrigeration that is installed. So, and that it really does come down to that, not just the walk-ins, but the part that you don't see, that all that refrigeration that's underneath the floor and ceiling and all that kind of stuff. So now we're back to, what are you talking about here? You're talking about a liquidation scenario? You're talking about fair market value and continued use?
Right. Interesting. What other items might come up in a it was easy for me to see ag, tractors, combines, trucks, things like that. What else might come up in the grocery? Are we talking about the computers that they use, or that? Is that stuff even? Does that fall into your?
It does. A lot of these new point of sale systems are pretty elaborate, and inventory tracking systems. And their technology. So we were talking about your old 286 machine a little while back, right?
That's right.
Same scenario.
Okay.
Typically people buy those and run them for a very, very long time. Other things, groceries are kind of the new thing in the grocery business in the last couple of years have been this whole grab and go thing. So there's a lot more kitchen equipment in grocery stores.
Okay.
That's really one of the, so you see a lot more fresh bakery situations.
That's right.
The salad bar, hot bar, all those kind of situations are
so now you've got a combination of a restaurant and or of a grocery store restaurant, basically.
Exactly. And those two industries are coming together
Yeah, yeah.
a lot.
So construction, then, construction was another one. Pre 2008 collapse, we had a ton of it going on here. You may have had the same where you're at, but houses were being built and they were being sold at absurd prices. So what kind of a construction equipment are we? Have you covered the gamut of all sorts of construction equipment from the heavy
this is
movers?
typically what we like to refer to in the industry as yellow iron.
Yellow iron. Okay, so the heavy equipment.
Yeah.
The big dirt movers and earth movers. Excuse me.
Yeah. So it's kind of an interesting situation that's happened with that stuff lately. Let's just talk about what's going on right now, because that's kind of fascinating. So we had a surplus in the marketplace of, we had the big boom before the big bust, and so we had a lot of equipment in the marketplace. So then in the subsequent years, 2009, 10, 11, Cat, John Deere, Komatsu, all these big manufacturing companies, they cut way, way, way back on production. They just cut back to skeleton crews and just like everybody else in the construction industry, just to if we can cover our overhead for a couple of years here and make it through, that'll be a win.
Right.
Okay. So fast forward now to December of 2015, where people are out in the marketplace looking for used equipment that was purchased, that was properly put into service in 2009, 10, 11, 12. It's a couple of years old. Like to get a deal. Doesn't exist.
Really?
Yeah. So there's this big there's this big hole in the road, of used equipment that it's just not out there anymore. So gently used, used equipment, and this is true with trucking too. It's transportation too, by the way, because they did the same thing for exactly the same reason.
And they probably came back kind of. At least the two would correlate with if one's coming back, the other's coming kind of along with it. Yeah.
So, and both factors are going on that we're seeing, especially if it's post 2010 and has a 2010 or later engine in it, so it meets CARB standards in California. By CARB, I mean the California Air Resources Board.
Okay.
So I'm talking about the diesel and particulate matter regulations. Everything past 2010, that stuff is that's going for good money.
Interesting. So we got about 5 to 7 minutes left. We want to keep it about 58 minutes, then we can re-upload it on Facebook and so forth. I'd like to have a little fun in this part of the conversation with, what would you tell somebody coming into this business? What would you tell? What is the future of your business, and what would you tell a newcomer? Maybe somebody just out of college who was thinking about getting into it.
Well, that's interesting, because there's a young gentleman here in town that used to be one of my scout troops back in the day, and he came back from college he's always been a great kid, and he came back from college. He was hanging around in town, and I was like, let's have lunch. Let me talk to you a little bit about appraisal practice, because here's what's happening.
Okay.
It's really kind of, I was just thinking about this earlier today, and I know one of the reasons I'm involved in this profession is because of the other people that are involved in it. They are wonderful people, and they are, I have the ASA, the American Society of Appraisals, it has been just, and the people in it have been just outstanding, and and really there's a real sense of camaraderie, and we're all going to help each other out here. Because it's a very, very unique field, and if we help each other out, we all do better.
Right.
And the problem is that a lot of these people are still working into their 70s because they love this stuff. It's fun.
Right.
Every day is different,
Right.
But a lot of them are starting to retire, and so there is certainly. And I actually have a whole presentation. I go out to colleges and universities and talk to the accounting and finance clubs. It's like, have you ever considered, and most of those guys are very, they're looking at the big four accounting firms and stuff like that.
Right.
I used to work for KPMG. I understand that scenario, but just put this in the back of your head that there's a field out there called being an appraiser that's just going to be very rewarding on many different levels. To the people you work with, it's I'm not going to be a multimillionaire, but I'm comfortable.
It can be lucrative, or it can make you comfortable. And it sounds like, from what you're saying, that, as with many fields, with baby boomers who are going to start retiring and so forth, that there may be some real opportunity in this field, whereas some other fields are really impacted these days. Are they? It sounds like you're saying that for those looking at the future, that there may be a real opening or real opportunity here.
Yeah.
Is it?
There is, and what the people that I see that tend to really do well in the appraisal world are people that have somehow or another in their past put themselves in the middle of the transaction. And as you see on my CV, I used to run an auction company. So you stand up in front of a group of people and you say, how many people, how many dollars you tell me, da, 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 and people looking at you, and they're, you got 250 professional buyers looking at you, and they know what it's worth and they know what they're going to pay. And so that's, that you learn a lot in that experience. Anytime you put yourself in the transaction. I've known a lot of BV appraisers, business valuation appraisers. So they're appraising for goodwill and copyrights and intangibles, that have worked in banks, and they've looked at a lot of financial statements, and they've triaged, then they put together a lot of deals. And so those, a lot of business valuation people have a tendency to come out of the banking world, because for that same reason, when we're talking about when I say, fine art and stuff like that, a lot of those are people that worked in galleries, and same with gems and jewel people. These are all very different types of appraisals.
And what you're saying is absolutely accurate to what we see in those different areas of appraisal and valuation on our website. You basically just explained, yes, a lot of them who do business valuation come from banking. Some do come from accounting and so forth, but maybe it's accounting and then banking and so forth. And that's very common to see those types of experience in those. A lot of those who go into the real estate appraisal and valuation, maybe they started off as a sales agent or as a realtor, and then found a different way to do it. And so your advice would be to keep your mind open for those young, for those who may be coming out of college, to keep your mind open to this as an opportunity in the future.
Oh, absolutely. Especially if you've got just kind of tag a little bit on there. It's a very unique profession because it requires analytical skills over here and ability to tell a story, be able to put those two together.
Right.
A lot of people have strengths in one or the other. But be able to put them together and to say and to not produce the one sheet wonder. And to have it's like, okay, here's the background. Here's what the marketplace looks like. This is why we're looking at this marketplace. Why it's germane to this to this argument, to this appraisal, and what are the factors involved? And here are the analytical procedures that I've gone through to
arrive at this value.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, interesting. So for our listeners today, we were visiting with Jack Young. He is an accredited senior appraiser, specializing in machinery and equipment appraisals. And Jack, where can people find you?
Best place is the website at norcalvaluation.com.
And you can find that in the chat. If anybody's watching the replay of this, I've got a link to his expert witness profile on Experts.com in the chat. And I've also got the norcalvaluation.com in the chat. And Jack, it's been a real pleasure talking with you. I'm glad you were able to do this with me today. And we'll think about some shorter ones next time.